Ladies and gentlemen, we are now live. Welcome to the first League of Women Voters of Greenwich event for 2021. My name is Aya D. Simone. I'm a member of the board of the League of Women Voters of Greenwich and co-chair of the Communications Committee. We're happy to see so many of our members and non-member friends joining us today for another high quality, informative, and engaging community conversation. Thank you all for your continued support and participation. Last year, the League of Women Voters of Greenwich produced and co-sponsored many successful high-quality programs. And our pipeline for 2021 promises to be just as exciting with a lot of great programs planned for you throughout the year. Be sure to check your email inbox for invitations for upcoming events. And of course, you can always visit our website at any time to see what's up next or what you may have missed. If you're not already a member, please consider joining us for access to even more members-only programs and information. Just visit lwvggreenwich.org online, and it's quick, easy, and inexpensive to join and get a whole lot more access to the League and its programming. We love to stay connected with you also, so please follow us on YouTube to see our videos and on social at Facebook and Instagram to engage with us. Today's event will be recorded and available on our YouTube account as well as our website tomorrow morning if you miss any of it. And now for a quick overview of how today's discussion will work. Today's event will be a webinar discussion, followed by a moderated audience Q&A. Only the presenters and the hosts will be visible and audible on camera. The audience will be in view-only mode for the duration of the event. To ask any questions, the audience just needs to go to the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen towards the right-hand side of your Zoom screen. We will not use the raised hand tool today. We'll only use the Q&A tool. And our moderators will direct your questions to the presenters as they appear on a first in, first asked basis. So without further delay, let's get started. Remember, democracy works best when we engage in civil discourse. So thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy this discussion about strengthening confidence in our American democracy. And with that, I'll hand it over to my League colleague, Jennifer Dayton. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Dayton, and I'm gratified that we could bring so many residents together tonight. I will introduce our panelists. Stephen Heintz is chairman and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. In 2010, he set an ambitious path to align investment of the fund's financial assets with its mission, resulting in its 2014 decision to divest from fossil fuels. Heintz has devoted his career to strengthening democratic culture and institutions. In 2018, he was named by the Academy of Arts and Sciences as one of 3 co-chairs of a national commission on the practice of democratic citizenship. Before joining the RBF, Heintz co-founded Demos, a public policy organization that works to reduce political and economic inequality. He served as executive vice president and chief operating officer for the East-West Institute in Prague during the 1990s. Heintz is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and of the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. He is the recipient of the Council on Foundation's 2018 Distinguished Service Award. Our other panelist, Norman Ornstein, is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank, where he studies politics, elections, and the US Congress. He is a co-host of AEI's Election Watch series, a contributing editor and columnist for National Journal and The Atlantic, a BBC News election analyst, and the chairman of the Campaign Legal Center. Dr. Ornstein previously served as co-director of the AEI Brookings Election Reform Project and senior counselor to the Continuity of Government Commission. A longtime observer and analyst of American politics and the US Congress, he has been involved in political reform for decades, particularly campaign finance reform and the reform of Senate committees. He has also played a part in creating the Congressional Office of Compliance and the House Office of Congressional Ethics. Welcome to our panelists. Over to you, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you, and I really am delighted to be here with my friend and colleague, Norm Ornstein, at an important moment. And it means a great deal to me to have a chance to be with all of you in Greenwich. As some of you may know, I have a long personal history in Connecticut. I grew up in Wilton. My wife grew up in Wilton, in Greenwich, and my mother-in-law, Louisa Stone, is still there in Greenwich with all of you. And I also served in Connecticut state government for 15 years in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So Connecticut is really a place that is deep in my heart. I'm going to start this evening with I think, a brief overview of the commission and its process, because there were some important features of how we actually conducted this work. So the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which was established in 1780 by John Adams and other American founders, set about forming this commission in the summer of 2017 to address the widespread sense that our constitutional democracy faced a crisis. It was a crisis that predated 2016. In fact, it's been decades, I think, in the making. But if we didn't see the full depth of the crisis before, the truly horrific events of last week have made it acutely evident. The commission has 35 members. It's a very distinguished and very diverse group of Americans that come from all sectors of our society: academia, the nonprofit sector, journalism, government, etc. And also, importantly, across the ideological perspective. And as Jennifer said, I've had the honor to serve as one of the 3 co-chairs of this commission. The commission did a lot of the things that national commissions often do. We gathered a lot of data and analyzed it. We scoured the literature and read widely about political reform. We consulted with a lot of experts, but we did something else that was even more important in my view. And that was, we set about to listen to American citizens. We conducted nearly 50 listening sessions across the country, running the gamut from cadets at the Naval Academy in Annapolis to Somali refugees in Lowell, Massachusetts, conservative leaders in Jackson, Mississippi, municipal employees in Los Angeles, really all across the great diversity of this country, geographically and in every other way. And the voices of these citizens really informed our process at every stage. And I hope that if you have a chance to read our common purpose, you'll see that we quote these citizens throughout. So we published the report in June of this year, and we've been enormously gratified so far by the attention it has received. I'll just mention now that we've fulfilled requests for over 13,000 hard copies of the report and nearly 20,000 downloads of the PDF version and tens of thousands of visits to our website. So it's clearly the runaway bestseller in the history of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Writing in the New Yorker recently, Evan Osnos referred to the report as, quote, the civic equivalent of the 9/11 Commission report, a blueprint for avoiding another political catastrophe. So before we get into the recommendations, the specifics, and our plans to achieve them, I want to turn to Norm with a few questions, and I'm going to start with 3, Norm. So first, when you were originally approached to join the commission, what persuaded you to say yes? Second, what were some of the challenges facing American democracy in 2018 as you saw them, and that informed the commission's work? And what thoughts do you have about the state of democracy today? And what were your personal aspirations for the commission, and how do you think we've measured up to them?
Great question, Stephen. So let me start. I've been a member of the Academy since 2004 and actually led an effort which was in some ways a small predicate to what the commission did. It was an effort to look at American institutions and the common good. looking more at institutions, while the focus of the commission started with citizens. It really was about the nature of citizenship. But as I went through that earlier exercise, it became clear to me that whatever institutions we were talking about, governmental institutions, those parts of civil society, from labor to business and on, that we had a challenge, and we had a growing challenge. Now, frankly, that was a challenge as well that I had foreseen over decades of being immersed in our politics here in Washington. My friend and colleague, a member of the Academy for longer than I have been, Tom Mann, and I wrote a book in 2006 called The Broken Branch about how Congress was failing America and moving away from the need to have debate and deliberation on the common good, and away from what we call the regular order in the process. We then wrote a book in 2012 called It's Even Worse Than It Looks, revised in 2014 to It's Even Worse Than It Was. And through all of this, we saw that not only were we falling into a pattern of polarization in our politics, which has been evident for some time, and it's something that has many, many causes that go back really to the 1960s. But the reality is you can be polarized and still have a society focused on the common good with just different points of view about how we achieve it. But we were becoming tribalized, and that started in Washington and then metastasized to states and to the public as a whole. And if you're tribalized, you no longer look at those with different points of view as worthy Americans who just may be misguided, but we can find ways to work together, and instead view them as the enemy trying to destroy our way of life. We saw this as being somewhat asymmetric, but that's a different topic. And through all of that, I was becoming more alarmed with where the country was going. So when the Academy moved to do this and started with just three of the best co-chairs that I could possibly imagine, not just Stephen, but Danielle Allen and Eric Liu, there was no way I could say no to being involved. Another reason was that I've devoted a good portion of my career to looking at a lot of the areas of political reform that we were going to consider and take up. Going through this process was an illuminating one because it was different from most commissions. And you touched on some of it. A much more deliberative process and an attempt to reach out more broadly, but also a group of people, very, very thoughtful people, who started understanding that we were going to have some differences in our worldview or our partisanship, but also all, I think, shared the belief that we were approaching an existential moment in the country's future. And knowing that we wanted our recommendations to be unanimous where we could achieve them, but also understanding that that meant that we might not be able to accomplish all that some of us individually wanted, but also recognizing something else. And that's, I think, key to where we are and where we're going. Our problems are not just structural ones. There are real structural anomalies, and they're growing. The framers' model was set during a very different time in the country and the world. Just to pick one example, the ratio of population between the smallest and largest state was 10 or 12 to 1 at the time that the Constitution was put together, and it's now over 70 to 1. And so some of the ways in which we tried to resolve the differences are that were a balance have grown into a much greater imbalance. But it's also a recognition that the problems are cultural. And not just structural. But for me and for many of the others, I think also a recognition that you have to start somewhere. And recommendations that focus on culture may have to start with making some changes in structure. Changes in structure may help us bring about what we need in the culture, but also alert people to the realities. And this is another thing, I'll get to your third question in a moment. If you don't deal with structural anomalies, over time, you're going to have an increasing sense of illegitimacy that grows across many areas of the society. And we can have an illegitimacy, or sense of illegitimacy that we have now, when in fact the system works legitimately. But it's much worse if in fact that sense of despair and illegitimacy comes because it's not working the way it's supposed to. Now, as to where we are, I'm right now seated in the middle of Washington. I'm maybe a mile from, probably just about a mile from the assault on the Capitol. I've lived here for pretty much 50 years with just brief periods away, and I've been immersed in our politics. And for most of that time, when I would go down to the Hill, whether I was working there or doing research or working with members from the outside to try and bring about some changes, if I would drive down Pennsylvania Avenue and I would see that Capitol dome, my heart would flutter a little bit. I've spent much of my career in and around Congress. Congress is the symbol of our freedom and democracy. One of the things that I've done along the way that Jennifer just briefly alluded to is work for years in the aftermath of the 9/11 assaults, because I understood that United 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania was headed for the Capitol Dome. Wasn't headed for the White House. We know it now definitively, because the terrorists knew that if they could hit the symbol of American freedom and democracy with the Statue of Freedom at its top, they could decapitate our government and decapitate Congress. We have barely dodged a bullet this past week. There is little doubt that the kind of attack, not from foreign terrorists, but from within, that breached this building that should be secure at a moment when all the members of Congress were there deliberating and the vice president was in the chair, that we could have seen Congress blown up, the building destroyed, no Congress, no ability to effect a legitimate transfer of power. And we know that even after all of this, the divisions that we have continue. You know, when 9/11 happened, all 535 members of Congress, a couple of days later, gathered on the steps of the Capitol to sing God Bless America, to let the world and the country know that we were bloodied but unbowed. Now we're bloodied and bowed and divided. And that's been reinforced this week. Now, a little less, in a sense, when Donald Trump was first impeached, there was not a single Republican in the House who joined in that effort. Today, there were 10. It's a small number, but it is the most bipartisan impeachment in the history of the country of a president. We've had a very different attitude expressed by many members. Maybe we're a little bit more jolted into understanding how easy it is to lose that fundamental freedom that we have. And I think even more important to double down on our common purpose and on the reforms and changes that we talk about there. We have to be sure we can make them bipartisan, and that's still going to be a heavy lift. But we have to take the dialogue that we had in our commission and spread it more widely around the country. If people focus on the fact that we are in a dangerous point in our country's history and that we could all lose, that it really is divided we fall time, maybe we will get a broader support for what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Norm. You have really introduced this work extraordinarily well, and I want to now kind of move to the specifics. You've given us the diagnosis and the urgency of where we are, and I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the way we've structured our recommendations. So first of all, as Norm has said, it's clear that we have structural flaws, and there are needs to reform our political institutions and our political processes. But we came to conclude in the work of the commission that reforming our political institutions was necessary but insufficient. If we don't also address weaknesses in our civil society and in our political culture, our civic culture, we actually won't have the democracy that we need for the 21st century. We concluded that when things are not working well in any one of those three domains, political institutions, civil society, or civic culture, the democracy is weak. And we need to work on them simultaneously and together, and we need to work on them urgently. We also concluded that our democracy has grown anachronistic, that it is in many ways unable to manage the kinds of 21st century challenges like the COVID pandemic or climate change that we're facing. So we decided it wasn't sufficient to reform our democracy. It is essential that we reinvent it for the requirements of this century. So our recommendations cut across these three domains: political institutions, civil society, and civic culture. And I'm not going to go into all of them. I'm just going to highlight a few. There are 31 specific recommendations in our common purpose. Many of them, I think, are actually quite bold, which is remarkable in a way that we were able to achieve consensus on these recommendations. So first, we're very much supportive of independent redistricting commissions to end gerrymandering. We offer several recommendations to constrain the pernicious effects of money in our politics. We would like to make it easier for people to vote while protecting the integrity of the voting system. And this includes a recommendation for what we call universal duty voting, which means that everybody has a duty to vote, although they do not have to vote for an individual candidate or a party. They simply have to participate. And this is the system that exists in Australia. We recommend a major investment in the kinds of civic infrastructure like the Greenwich Library, which is one of the sponsors of tonight's event. The kinds of civic spaces where people do gather for these kinds of conversations and meetings and work together in communities. And these are the places in civil society that make our communities resilient in times of crisis. We also call for a major reinvestment in civic education opportunities for Americans of all ages, not just school children, but adults as well, and not just curriculum in educational settings, but experiential civic learning. And we would like to see a major commitment to national service, to create a culture of service in our society and provide opportunities for more Americans to leave their bubbles, their social, economic, and political bubbles, and work side by side with fellow citizens who are different from them. We propose a tax on digital advertising to create a public fund that would support local journalism, which, as you know, has really been devastated in recent years, and also to support experiments in social purpose social media, because we understand that social media has had many positive benefits, but it has also really eroded our understanding of the truth and our ability to work together across lines. And to, the spread of misinformation is just a very serious threat to our democracy. So these are just a few of the recommendations. And there were some, although we achieved consensus on 31, there were some where we couldn't achieve consensus. And I know one of them is of particular interest to the League of Women Voters, and that's the elimination of the Electoral College. And Norm, I'm wondering if you might speak to this question a little bit and explain why we weren't able to achieve consensus on this, and share your own view about the Electoral College.
Absolutely, Stephen. Let me start by saying that in the 44 elections from when we really first began to count popular votes in a serious manner, 1824 through 1996, there were arguably one or two only in which it was clear cut that the president who was elected had lost the popular vote. Since then, 2 out of 5, and we know that there are likely to be more. And we know something else, which is that by 2040, 70% of Americans will live in 15 of our 50 states. 50% will live in only 8 of those states. And that means that the distortions that the Electoral College provides, giving more weight to smaller states, will grow. And so it's a challenge, but a challenge that has a few avenues to ameliorate it. Certainly, the most direct avenue would be a constitutional amendment to simply eliminate the Electoral College. Our members were divided on this front. There are some who are still tied to the idea of the Electoral College, that it is something that distinguishes America from other countries, that it gives weight to smaller states, and that a constitutional amendment is, after all, a heavy lift. I think there's a partisan element to this, which was not as significant in our deliberations, but which is clearly out there. And you could see that in the reflections of actually some of the Republicans in Congress now, who have very flatly said, if we give up the Electoral College, we will never win another presidential election. I don't think that's accurate. In fact, my own view is that it would be one of the most healing things that we could do, because the imperative to appeal to a majority of Americans instead of falling back on a minority where you can win because of the distortions would actually be a very positive thing, but we're not there at this point. Now, there are other mechanisms that we talked about, one of them being something, actually, I was on a call this morning with a group making every vote count. And that's the National Popular Vote Compact, where we have just about 200 electoral votes signed up, trying to reach the goal of the 270 that make a majority. Which is that states pass laws saying that once you've achieved the majority, that those states which control the Electoral College would direct their electors to vote for the winner of the national popular vote. We ended up talking about this a lot, but really moving in a slightly different direction, a more indirect way, but a way that actually solves more problems than one, or at least ameliorates them. And that was to enlarge the House of Representatives. Right now, the voters of Wyoming have a huge advantage in their power to select a president over the voters of California. They have 1/70th of the population of California, but about 1/20th of the votes when it comes to the Electoral College. The House has not been enlarged since 1910. In 1929, as we approached the 1930 census, Congress passed a law capping the size at 435. To be blunt, the fundamental reason that they did this dragged their feet from 1910 on, from doing what had been done with every census before that, which is to adjust the size of the House depending on the population shifts. It was an ages-old thing. As more and more African-American voters moved into areas where they were going to get more seats, the conservatives and pro-segregationists decided that they wanted to put a halt to that. Now, that's not the only reason to enlarge the House. Our districts are so big right now, and they do not reflect the diversity of the country in any effective fashion. We can make members move closer to the public as a whole. But the fact is, if we enlarge the House by, say, 100 members, then we're going to dilute somewhat, because those seats mostly are going to go to the states where population has increased, the distortions of the Electoral College. So we can improve representation and reduce those distortions. It's not the big step that many of us would like to take, but it's a very positive step if we could achieve it. And it can be done by legislation, not by requiring a constitutional amendment.
Yeah, exactly. It was really interesting to me that this was probably the most important recommendation where we couldn't achieve consensus. And I think, as you were saying, Norm, that a good part of the reason is that some members of the commission still feel that the Electoral College system is one of the checks and balances in our constitutional democracy. I share Norm's view. I think the Electoral College is an anachronism and that it distorts our politics, and I personally would favor its elimination. And interestingly enough, although it would take a constitutional amendment, and we only recommend one constitutional amendment, and that is to overturn the Citizens United decision about campaign finance, we have amended the Constitution 5 times in my lifetime. So constitutional amendments are not impossible. So before we turn to your questions, and I really do want to get there, just a last word on what we're doing to advance the implementation of these ideas. First, of course, is that we're doing a lot of events like this. And again, thank you for having us. We are, members of the commission are out speaking to groups all the time, and we're doing quite a bit in the media. We're also giving special briefings to key stakeholders, including lots of members of Congress in both parties and both chambers. Tomorrow, we will be giving a briefing to people in the Biden transition team. We have been building a coalition of champion organizations to advance the individual recommendations, and they are working in states and at the national level. And we have more than 40 signed on so far, and we are trying to create a kind of loose coalition of democracy reformers and finding ways to support their work to advance these recommendations. Many of them can start in the states or in municipal government, but 20 of them would ultimately require an active Congress to fully implement them. We're also doing more work on some topics where the recommendations are very preliminary and where there is more design work that is necessary. And we're trying to inspire my colleagues in philanthropy to invest more funding in this kind of work all across the country, because we make major investments in trying to promote democracy abroad, but we invest very, very little in trying to strengthen our own democracy at home. And our overall goal, and the commission is continuing to work, the American Academy is committed to this. Our overall goal is that we want to see significant progress on all 31 of these recommendations by 2026, which after all is the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation. So thank you for listening to this conversation, and maybe we can turn it back over to our hosts for some questions from the audience.
Sure. Yes, we will go to the audience Q&A now. Okay, so the first question is, I read your report. Thank you for doing this work. I feel it is imperative to have term limits for Congress and Senate. Can or why was this not addressed in your report?
Norm, you've been studying Congress for decades.
Yeah. We certainly didn't have a consensus on term limits. And one reason is that the experience that we've seen with term limits in state legislatures suggests that it backfires very quickly. The idea behind term limits, more than anything, is the idea of trying to channel ambition away from the drive for re-election, to create more citizen legislators who will then focus more on the common purpose than on their own narrower needs. But the reality is that term limits channel ambition even more in the wrong direction. What happens, and California is a good example of this, is that you will see people who get elected to the state assembly who immediately start planning when their terms are up on how they can move to the state senate. And those who are in the state senate start looking either at running for Congress or at becoming lobbyists. And actually, it can be even more distorting in that sense. And then at the same time, when you lose that sense of institutional memory, the power reverts to the staff, the permanent staff, and to the lobbyists as well, who've been around for longer. So we had real misgivings about term limits as a way of resolving our problems. I wish that it were different, frankly. I wish that we could get a different sense of noble purpose. Some of the other reforms that we've talked about in our report, including the campaign finance ones, would be more effective if we could move people away from what we have now, which is that the average member of Congress spends 6 hours a day, more time in what's called call time, going off the campus of Congress to make calls to raise money and beg for money than they do debating, deliberating, or doing the other work that they do. And of course, it's distorting when you're more willing to listen to those who will give you money than to the broader public as a whole.
With winner-take-all awarding of electoral college votes, it doesn't favor small states, it favors swing states, most of which have above average population. Did you discuss the reasons why one party is uniformly opposed to measures to increase voter access and make elections more representative? How do we convince people that voting is good?
Yes, well, we certainly discussed this at great length, and many of our recommendations address the voting system and efforts to make voting both easier while protecting the integrity of voting and reducing voter suppression, et cetera, and eliminating barriers. There are just some systemic barriers to being able to participate. This is a question, and Norm alluded to this earlier, that really goes back in our American history, that there have been cynical, frankly, political efforts to restrict voting in order to maintain the status quo or in order to favor one party over another. And for a country that says that it is a democratic republic, many Americans are feeling that our representative democracy is neither very representative nor very democratic as a result. And so we really think, and we have quite a few recommendations in this regard, that making voting easier is essential. And in fact, we had one citizen that we quote in the report who said to us, voting ought to be insanely easy. This was a person in rural Virginia. And I think he's right. We don't want to have abuse in the voting system. We want a highly reliable voting system, but we want to make it easy for people. We want voting to be something that is both a citizen responsibility, but also a joy and something that people take pride in, as many of us do. So we recommend making Election Day a national holiday. In fact, we suggest that it should be on Veterans Day, which is already a holiday, and thereby we're honoring the veterans who have, served their nation in honor of our democracy and letting people vote. We recommend universal voter registration so that registering to vote becomes automatic. We talk about making voting a universal duty like jury service. And all of these things would improve access to the ballot and overcome some of the distortions that we have.
Let me just add a couple of things there. First, the questioner is right that the sort of folklore that small states benefit from the Electoral College is simply false. The two senators from North Dakota have tried to make that point. If you take away the Electoral College, nobody will pay any attention to us. Nobody pays any attention to them now. And the reason is it's a firmly red state. And, their electoral votes are in the bag, as the questioner suggested. It's when you have more and more red states and blue states, the Electoral College becomes a very different kind of focal point. If, in fact, you had a national popular vote and you anticipated a close election, then those voters in North Dakota would matter. That could make all the difference, and people would pay a little bit more attention to them. But the second part of the question was about why one party doesn't want to see changes here. And of course, it's because it's advantaged by the Electoral College. And the Republican Party at this point believes that they don't have to seek a majority support in the country, that they can win without it, and they can win by motivating their voters and suppressing the votes of others in those swing states. That's not a healthy development in the country. And that's why we try to push back with all these reforms on voting. But it's important to note that even this week, we've seen the governor of Georgia and the secretary of state in Georgia, who were heroic in protecting the integrity of the elections this time, both in November and for the Senate runoff elections, but are now moving to try and restrict those votes for the midterm elections ahead. And the chair of the Republican Party in Texas today called for even more dramatic and drastic partisan gerrymandering. So we've got work cut out for us to keep it from backsliding, much less to move in the direction of some of the reforms that we hope we will be able to implement ultimately.
This next one is more of a comment. It's and quoting the Constitution, quote, "The number of representatives shall not exceed one for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least one representative," close quote. U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. And then says, today each district has over 700,000 people.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And Norm spoke to this earlier. You know, Norm talked about the legislation in 1929 that expanded the size of the House from 65 members to the current 435 members. So this change can be made. The Constitution provides that this can be done by an act of Congress, which is one of the reasons why expanding the House is an attractive recommendation. But it is true, you know, going from a Congress that truly represented the people to the kind of mass relationship between members of Congress today and their constituents is just not a very representative democracy.
In the United States, particularly post-2008, there's been a disturbing decrease in the number of certified school librarians in public schools. How can we expect to educate information literate citizens when we have cut the front line of media specialists from our schools? How about legislating that every school must have a certified media specialist?
Well, it's a very interesting idea. Having served in state government, the one hesitation that I would have is that if you're going to adopt a mandate like that, you also have to be willing to finance the mandate. And this, you know, gets into local budgets like the Greenwich municipal budget and the education funding. So I think it's a perfectly reasonable idea. If our kids are going to be literate in the world of digital knowledge, we're going to have to be investing more in our public libraries and our school libraries in order to equip them with that education and knowledge and experience.
And I think the public libraries become also extraordinarily important here. You cannot, as a citizen, thrive in this country without access to high-speed internet. You need a device, but you also need to have the ability to get the access. You're not going to get a job if you can't go online. You're not going to be able to find out where you can get a COVID test, much less a vaccine, without being able to register online. And this is true of almost every element in our society now, and certainly if we're going to compete globally. But if you're going to be able to thrive and survive, we need to have those tools, and libraries have become the places in community that provide them, and also the places where homeless people can go if they need to go to the bathroom, or if they're going to be able to have access themselves to any of the information that exists in the society. And I'm a little worried now as our states find that their balanced budget requirements have been obliterated because of COVID and are going to struggle and may have to cut back on services. We need to make sure that these are not the services that get cut. And that's true in the schools, but it's also true more broadly in the communities.
Yeah.
To Mr. Heintz's observation that many of these reforms can be started in the states, That's what Voter Choice Connecticut is doing with respect to ranked choice voting, which is one of the recommendations in our common purpose for strengthening representative democracy. How do you suggest we use your recommendation or report to make progress in Connecticut beyond citing it, which we do frequently?
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the work that you are doing. We are seeing a movement really across the states of our great country toward ranked choice voting, which I think is a very, very important recommendation. And what we are trying to do to help you is to constantly call out RCV, as it's known in shorthand, as one of the key recommendations that would really help modernize and strengthen American democracy. And we're also trying, through this coalition of organizations, to build a movement around RCV. And we'd love to chat with you about how you can join this coalition and what we can do to support you. And then finally, we're also trying to raise additional funds to support groups like yours so that you have the resources to really carry out, you know, the education, public education, and advocacy campaigns that are necessary to accomplish these kinds of reforms at the state legislature.
I have another one. At what point, though, does the size of the House make it unwieldy? Is there any research or examples of this? If you had 10,000 representatives, 1 per 30,000, then the House would need to elect its own House.
There are limits, and obviously we can't go back, you know, both physically, but also keep in mind that the framers very deliberately gave our legislature the name Congress and not the name Parliament. It comes from the Latin word meaning to come together. Parliament, of course, is from the French word parler, and it reflects a parliamentary system where the real power is in the hands of that small group of the government. And the parliament exists to implement the government's policy, and the speaking is about the question period that we all know about. We were supposed to come together and meet face to face to debate and deliberate, to put yourself in others' shoes, knowing that there'd be people who would have legitimate viewpoints because they represent different kinds of people with different interests. So we have to strike a balance here. I actually think that while, you know, to achieve our consensus, we talked about 50 to 100. There's a formula that's been proposed by former Representative Tom Downey that makes a lot of sense to me, which is that you set the size of the House, the appropriate size of the House, as the size of the smallest state, which now would be Wyoming at 592,000. And that would mean adding about 170 to 180 members. We could barely handle that with the physical plant that makes the Capitol. It would move us further away from that face-to-face, but still is within the range. And if we add to that, adding some, allowing, as we do in our report, some multi-member districts, which is just changing a 1967 law that says only single-member districts, and bring in ranked choice voting, we might get a better range and more representativeness, less of a sort of uniformity in the districts that we now have, that would add to the representativeness of the House itself. So a lot of these reforms could work in conjunction.
Citizens United has taken the common voters' power away. I feel that I cannot compete with my vote against Microsoft, Apple, etc. What is being done to repair the damage caused by this disastrous Supreme Court decision?
Well, this is the one recommendation that we make that is a recommendation for a constitutional amendment. We agree with the sentiment expressed in the question. The decision of Citizens United, plus several other Supreme Court decisions, have really damaged our democracy by opening the floodgates to money. And citizen voices are so outweighed when it comes to the equation of voice versus dollars. And as Norm said, members of Congress are, you know, required just for survival to spend a great deal of time fundraising in this competitive environment. So we do recommend a constitutional amendment to give Congress the legal authority to regulate money in politics so that it doesn't violate the First Amendment concerns that the Supreme Court articulated. That's not enough, though, and of course, a constitutional amendment is a detailed and lengthy process. But there is a real good movement around this issue too across the country. There are several groups that are working and making progress in the states, building up support for a constitutional amendment. But other things that we can do include making money more transparent, requiring the disclosure of the donors so that we know who's contributing to which candidate, and we can see who they're beholden to. And that too would be a good step. But this is a fundamental problem in our democracy. I mean, you look at just the Senate races in Georgia and the special election, the runoffs, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in both of those campaigns. And it just is really kind of appalling. So this, I think, is a fundamental reform that we just need to keep working at.
What would happen if more seats were established in the Senate?
Well, here we have a catch-22.
Yeah.
Because Article 5 of the Constitution guarantees each state equal representation in the Senate. And I'll go back to the numbers I mentioned earlier, which suggest that this is a really troubling problem that we have ahead. 70% of Americans in another 2 decades are going to live in 15 states. That means 30% of Americans will elect 70 of the 100 senators. And those states are not, and those citizens are not representative of the diversity of the country or its economic dynamism. And it's very difficult to deal with this without constitutional change. And the catch-22 in Article 5 is you'd probably need to have a whole new constitution. With one exception, we didn't get into this, but I've subsequently thought that you could have a constitutional amendment that doesn't take away from the states each having equal representation by having at-large senators, some elected nationally, some elected by regions of equal population. And you could add, say, 12 senators to do this, staggered the way that Senate seats are now for 6-year terms. And actually, you would then have people who represent the national interest or who represent much broader regional interests and all of the people in those particular regions. That's also a very, very heavy lift, of course. In the short run, the change that could take place is to add states. And of course, one of the things that's on the agenda of Democrats, which they won't be able to achieve without either having a supermajority or at some point altering the filibuster rule, is to add the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico as states, and very possibly others like the U.S. Virgin Islands. Here again, let me note that as we see this opposition, because it's all political, so many of the states that were added, the Western states in an earlier incarnation of the country, were done for partisan political reasons. We used to have a Dakota territories. Why do you think we have a North Dakota and a South Dakota? Because they decided that they could add to the conservative representation and white representation in the Senate by dividing it into 2 and getting 4 senators instead of 2. So this has been done before, and it would make a difference at the margins, but a pretty significant one in terms of getting that broader representation of the diversity in the country.
Yeah, and just if I could add one additional thought, this is because of the difficulties in making structural change to the United States Senate. This was another reason why we focused on the House, where we can make the changes of enlarging the House and making it more representative without a constitutional amendment. But the Senate is a problem today, and it is a looming problem down the road.
Did you discuss alternative voting methods? If so, what were your recommendations? If not, why not?
Well, if you mean digital voting and that kind of thing, we did discuss this. And we discussed voting by mail, which obviously became somewhat controversial in the recent election cycle. And we did ultimately recommend that voting by mail be available to all voters in times of emergency like the COVID pandemic, but we did not achieve consensus on simply saying voting by mail should be standard. There were still, although several states have been doing this for a number of years, where there are only mail-in ballots, for example, and they have very, very, minimal, almost no examples or cases of fraud. If people on the commission felt that we're not quite ready to move to digital voting, online voting, or even universal ability to vote by mail. So that was another area where we couldn't achieve quite the consensus that some of us had hoped for.
I would just add quickly that on our commission, we had people who are very sophisticated about the internet and about digital communication. The consensus there, and I think it's been reinforced by this hack of all of our government agencies that may put us in deep jeopardy in other ways, is for whatever controversies we have about the sanctity of our voting system, of voting machines and the like, they are magnified if you move to voting on the internet. So our focus has been finding ways to make people, to make it easier for people to vote without distorting the system too much in the ways in which we do it.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting one. Our local municipal body, the RTM, has at times been criticized for its size, 230 members. However, it is often the first experience our residents have in the civic process. Based on your comments on expanding the House, do you think large municipal bodies like ours actually increase engagement? Should municipalities and state legislatures consider expanding representation, or is it specific to Congress?
Well, being an old Connecticut hand, I am familiar with the RTM process, and I happen to be a fan of it for exactly the reasons the questioner suggests. I think it increases participation. It brings more voices into the debate of important local issues. It is, a place where we can learn the habits of the heart of democracy. How do we work with people? How do we, one of the points of all this work is that democracy itself is not just a system of making decisions. It is a culture. It's a way of behaving. It's a way of solving problems. It's a way of compromising and making progress. And you learn those things by participating in the democratic process, whether it's voting or being on a local board or a commission or running for a representative, a representative body like the RTM. So I am a big fan of it.
Let me just add, this is a point to give a shout out to another of our broader recommendations, and that's for national service. We want people to get engaged in the society and engaged in all of these processes, political, social movements, and otherwise. And if we can get young people to spend a year doing some kind of national service, and some of that might be working within bodies like these municipal organizations, that might go a long way towards making people understand that we are interconnected and interrelated as a society, and that we all should give something back if we want it to work better.
What are effective ways for individual supporters without specific organizational affiliations to help you achieve one or more of your goals? If better to be part of a group, what would be the best types of groups to affiliate with in order to make a difference?
Well, thank you very much for that question. There are a number of things that individuals who are interested in this can do, steps that you can take. And one of them is, for example, many of us are in book groups, and we are encouraging book groups to actually read Our Common Purpose and to have a book group meeting to discuss it. And that way the ideas get socialized and expanded and spread. And we have a study guide that is available on the website, and I think our hosts at the League of Women Voters are going to send that out to you tomorrow, along with a link to the report itself. So that's an easy step that you can take. Just invite your neighbors in, have them read the report and debate the recommendations. But more specifically to your question, we also have on the website lists of these champion organizations. So these are often state and local organizations that are working to advance one or another of these specific recommendations. And you can go and see those, and we encourage people, if you're interested in a particular recommendation, to then research the organizations that are working on that recommendation and contact them in Connecticut and see how you can join the effort. And we also hope that you'll raise these questions with Jim Heintz and your senators and talk to them about the need for reforms of our democracy. I know from our own work in Congress that there is a real awareness that this is a moment of real urgency. And I think that the more they hear from their constituents about the need for reform, the more progress we will make.
I have a great one. I agree that we should make access to voting easy and that it should be a duty and a privilege. How do we help all Americans feel confident about the integrity of our elections?
So having been around the election process for a long time, of course, every election has its anomalies and its issues and problems, and we did have some of those. And that included barriers, especially to people of color and students voting, which has become an endemic thing. We do have some questions about the nature of the voting machines. We have many questions about making sure that we have an adequate number of poll workers who are trained and able to handle these things. But I would say that this election was as fair in the end as any that I have seen in many decades. And what we need to do is a few things. One is there are organizations that work very hard at trying to make sure that elections are fair and free. The League of Women Voters is one of them. One that I chair, the Campaign Legal Center, is another. At the same time, we need to work within our own communities to make sure that elections are funded adequately. I'd love to see Congress do another Help America Vote Act, a better one this time, something that was done in the aftermath of the 2000 election debacle, because so many local communities, when faced with budget choices, think about whether they want to put the money into, say, garbage collection, which every citizen sees a couple of times a week, or an election which happens infrequently and nobody knows what money was spent or wasn't. All of those things are important to make sure that we feel that our elections actually are free and reflect what voters have said, and that voters are able to have that voice. But it's an ongoing, constant process.
And I would just add, it takes some investment too.
Yeah.
We have starved our electoral systems of the finance that they need to really have the most up-to-date, most reliable, and most accurate voting systems.
What are your thoughts on open primaries? Primaries appeal to extreme partisans, unaffiliated voters. Lost the question somewhere. Got away. Let me go to another one since that one kind of went away. Okay. Many of your recommendations seem to be heavy lifts. Which do you think are lighter lifts and have a realistic chance for implementation in the near future?
That's a tough one to answer. Obviously, a constitutional amendment is the particularly heavy lift. I think in a lot of areas, and this may be true in Congress ultimately, some of the reforms that we've suggested to make voting work better and easier may be a little closer than I would have feared otherwise. For example, moving Election Day to Veterans Day. so that it becomes a holiday that already exists and you don't have the additional cost of a new holiday. And makes sense to me because our veterans fought and bled and in some cases died to protect the right to vote, is something where we may be able to get a broader bipartisan support. I think there's bipartisan support for national service, and we've got at least a possibility of having something like that occur. Other reforms, including the campaign finance side, are not going to happen so easily. A quick word on open primaries. It is the case that if you leave a significant number of citizens out of selecting candidates, which is a critical part of an election, it becomes more difficult for them to accept the legitimacy of the system. But if you can move to an open primary, but also have ranked choice voting, so that you don't have the distorted effect of large numbers of candidates and maybe a third or fourth party altering the outcome in a way that the voters who vote for that third or fourth party may not intend, we may have a more open and fair system. That's another one of the reasons why we have strongly recommended ranked choice voting. And I would say it's particularly important at the presidential level, so that we don't have a Jill Stein or a Gary Johnson, entering a contest with a purpose of altering the outcome of the election.
Yeah, I would just add one other point to this very good question about what are the more likely recommendations to actually get adopted. Since so many of them can actually happen at the state level, it's really a state-by-state analysis. And that is the kind of analysis that we're working with our partners to do, to try to come up over the next few years with a schedule of effort. Because if it looks likely that ranked choice voting can happen in Connecticut, we should put some additional effort in to help make sure that that happens. Or if it looks likely that we can get a major congressional effort around national service, then we should be really supporting the groups that are working on national service. So it's really what we call kind of a ripeness analysis. Where are these ideas the ripest, and how can we help bring them to fruition?
Rule 8.4 of Lawyers' Code of Professional Conduct states that a lawyer shall not engage in conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. These words saved our democracy by restraining what could be argued in court challenges in the recent election. Could such language be applied to politicians and government officials consistent with the First Amendment?
The answer is no. Although, of course, this is one of those things that our social media outlets have grappled with and now have come down more firmly on the side of blocking elected officials who are spouting lies or misinformation, but it's pretty ineffective. There is a speech and debate clause in the Constitution that basically allows members of Congress to say almost anything that they want if they're practicing their official duties. There are remedies there, and some of them I think may be applied in coming weeks and months, including censure or even expulsion for some of these lawmakers, which would be appropriate. And I would just add, outside of our report, I have been very disappointed in bar associations all across the country that have taken no action whatsoever against lawyers who have abused the law and their own oath in some of these election challenges and have not been sanctioned at all. It's time for all of our citizen groups, including bar associations, to step up and put some constraints in this process.
Terrific. I think this will be our last question. Okay. Any thoughts on adding to the Supreme Court?
Well, we had a really great conversation about the Supreme Court. And in fact, we recommend not adding new justices or additional justices to the Supreme Court, but rather moving to term limits on the Supreme Court, 18-year term limits, and requiring that the appointments be on a regular basis, meaning that every 2 years during the 2-year cycle of each Congress, the president would have the opportunity over time as term limits occur to appoint one. So this over time then means that one president doesn't get to appoint so many members of the court or create a political distortion, and we have more variety in who's appointed. We have younger justices. We don't have people staying on the court decade after decade. And we think this is a way of helping to resolve the the kind of politicization of the court without adding to the court, which is extremely controversial. And this recommendation can also be implemented by statute. The terms of the Supreme Court are not fixed in the Constitution. And can I just say, since we're coming to a close, again, I just want to thank you all for being with us tonight and for your excellent questions. And I want to, in my own thoughts and comments tonight, just end with maybe a more hopeful note, because we are in a moment of deep crisis, I think, that calls on us to really reinvent our democracy. But the point is that we can do it, and we've done it in the past. And I'm reminded of something that de Tocqueville wrote when he said, the greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but in her ability to repair her faults. And this is one of those moments when all of us need to be part of the process of repairing the faults that currently exist in our democracy. So thank you for the work that you do at the League of Women Voters and the Greenwich Public Library. And thank you for being part of this conversation about our common purpose.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of the board of the League of Women Voters of Greenwich, I'd like to conclude by thanking you very, very much for a very informative and engaging presentation. This is a topic of paramount importance to all of us, and we appreciate all the work that has gone into creating your report. We are equally grateful to you for taking the time to share the findings of the Commission's report with us this evening. You have provided an abundance of food for thought. So thank you very much to both of you and to everyone for attending. Good night.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.